This is Everyday Discipleship, a podcast from Metro Church. My name is Cole Chenal. I'm one of the pastors at Metro Church. With me is Josh Rice. He is also a pastor at Metro Church. And this week we are finally coming to the end of our series on the Ten Commandments, where we've been looking at the Ten Commandments, what they mean in the life of the Christian, and how they fit with the grace of the gospel. So Josh, you want to read for us the last commandment that we're going to be talking about in this series?
Yep, the last commandment is found in Exodus 20, verse 17. The Lord says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." And so obviously when we've been teeing these up in the past, we've been talking about, in original context, what these things mean. Because this one particularly needs to be done that way, because I don't think
I don't really have a donkey or an ox.
No, we're not looking across the fence, and maybe out in the country you see a nice donkey that somebody has and you want to take it away. But I think this is also the commandment that is probably most applicable to the heart, and this is one of the big ones that has outflowings with a lot of the other commandments. Mm-hmm. And so, in contextualization, what is God telling the people here?
I think he's telling them ultimately that they need to be content with what God's given them. That it's a sin to look at what God has given you and say, you know what, that's not enough. Because covetousness is desiring something that is not yours, and really it's desiring anything other than God in an ungodly way. And so, like, when we talk about covetousness, the struggle and the temptation that I think all of us face, because some of us might think, oh, I don't covet. What does that really mean? Well, if you're desiring something and wishing it was your own, obsessing about it, dwelling on it, right? It's that idea that grass is always greener, right? That's how we might say it in our culture, that the grass is always greener over there, where we wish we had what other people have, and that our life is deficient because we don't have what they have. I mean, that's what covetousness is. You might call it jealousy, envy, and that's where you talk about, it results in all kinds of other sins, because jealousy and envy result in strife and anger and division between people, that rivalries between people. I was even reading Galatians 5 today, talking about how rivalries is a work of the flesh.
Yeah.
But really, at the end of the day, the simplest way I can talk about covetousness is that covetousness is desiring something that God has not, in His sovereignty, chosen to give you, and wishing it was yours from another person.
And so, in a way, kind of working off of something that I introduced a couple of podcasts ago was this idea that as the commandments go, as it goes into the second table, so to speak, which are the one another commands, that they start out with high crimes, murder, theft, adultery, and then they start to go more into the motivations and the heart behind them. And I think this one in particular, the big difference between covetousness and the other one another commands is that covetousness does not even necessarily come out as an action. This is entirely a commandment that deals with the heart.
Yeah, God talked about don't commit adultery, that's the action. Mm-hmm. Well, He says in here, don't covet your neighbor's wife.
That's right.
He says don't desire your neighbor's wife. He says don't steal. Well, He says here, don't covet your neighbor's ox or donkey. Like, don't take from them even in your own heart. And so, like you're saying, this gets down to fundamentally even the heart motivations that we think about, where it kind of eliminates this idea of like, well, I don't do XYZ activity because God looks at the heart.
That's right. And so in context, if you remember back a long time ago to the very first episode we did on the Ten Commandments, which was talking about what was God's desire in giving the people the law. Really, primarily, God's desire in giving His people law was to set them apart, to make them His people, to be a people that worship Him, so that they would know who God is. And really, the law shows the character of God. And in this sense, if God has set apart a people to Himself, this is going to be a people that worship God. And so covetousness, in a huge way, I think, is the opposite of worshiping God. Instead of worshiping God, we worship things, and we desire to have things, and we blame God for not giving us those things, and so we try to take them by our own means.
Well, we even desire those things more than God, because we say, you know what, God, you're not enough. Mm-hmm. That you're not as good as you say you are. You're not as generous as you say you are. And hitting that idea in the New Testament, where Paul says in Colossians 3:5, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which Paul says, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. That Paul says that covetousness, at its fundamental level, is idolatry. It is saying something is the ultimate treasure, the ultimate desire of my life, other than God.
And so in a lot of ways, covetousness there, Paul equates covetousness, which is not a crime, right? No one was being put in jail for covetousness. They were being, or put in jail, giving restitution or being executed, not for covetousness, but for the actions that come out of this heart of idolatry. And really, covetousness there has a synergy to the first commandment, right? Which in many ways we would say that a lot of scholars would say is the greatest commandment. Jesus says that first table, the two great commandments, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. Loving the Lord your God with all your strength is the great summary of the first table of the Ten Commandments. And covetousness not only breaks, its actions that come out break the loving your neighbor, but the heart of covetousness breaks the first commandment. Mm-hmm. And so they are intertwined. And that's because I think God's law is not a to-do list that we can check off as self-righteous things like, look, I didn't murder today, I didn't commit adultery today, I'm doing well. Covetousness becomes this blanket thing that says, am I content with the station, with the provision that God has given me? Do I worship him? Do I know that everything I have is a blessing from God, and therefore I give credit and I give worship to the one who's given me everything? That is truly the heart of worship. And I think that's what the people, God's desire to give them the law was for him to receive all the glory that was due to his name for what he had done with his people. And remember, he had brought them out of slavery. He had brought them out of bondage. He had miraculously got them out of the oppression of Egypt, and was already working ahead to give them a kingdom and a promised land that he had given them. All of this was God orchestrated. And so what he does as a kindness is tells them, well, that's how you're going to live. You're going to live in a way that glorifies me. And I think this commandment, maybe more than any of the other second table commandments, exemplifies this heart of worship. This, what does it mean to be godly?
And I think, if you're going to ask me that, I think the answer I would probably give right now is that to be godly means to treasure God and to enjoy him more than anything else. Because when we treasure God, when we enjoy him for who he is, obedience is what naturally follows. I mean, worship, we were talking about it even earlier on a totally different conversation. Worship, we look at worship so often as Christians as, okay, well, Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so, therefore, worship means obedience. Mm-hmm. That how we worship God is by obeying him. And I think that we can turn that on its head. It's like there's some nuance there where, yeah, that's kind of true, but it's not exactly true. That obedience is the expression of worship. That worship is really loving God, enjoying him for who he is. And out of that love for him, we say, you know what? I don't love my sin very much. It doesn't look as appealing to me. I want to obey God because I love him. I treasure him. I enjoy him. He's only been good to me. He's only provided everything I need. And so when you talk about covetousness, that's why I think Paul can say covetousness is idolatry, because covetousness produces in us a heart that basically says, God is not as enjoyable or as good as he says he is.
Mm-hmm. I need these things I need this thing to get ultimate enjoyment.
Yeah.
To have everything right.
To have the fullness of life, to have complete joy in my life.
And it kind of, because this episode kind of takes two hats, right? We're talking about covetousness, but we're also kind of capping this whole discussion that's ranged for, several hours now. And I think one of the things that comes to mind with me is that there's this idea that God has given us these commands, and I think we can easily see it in covetousness. God's given us these commands because he wants us to look like him, to desire the things that he desires. And so what God wants us to do instead of coveting is, I think the opposite of covetousness is to be thankful for what God has done and to be grateful, understanding that we deserve nothing because we're sinners and we're rebels against God. And so therefore, how can we covet when we've been given so much?
Well, what's so funny is that here's the subtle play of covetousness that's so destructive, is that when you start coveting other things that are not yours, everything you do have starts looking raggedy in paltry in comparison.
That is true.
I mean, like, let's talk about different ways like we covet, right? One way that I know I struggle with right now is listen, I have a great home. I mean, God's provided me a home that is great. We bought it new construction, but it's starting to feel a little small. Having a kid, thinking about kids on the way, thinking about having 2 dogs that are gigantic monsters, and we have whole sections of our life even devoted towards covetousness. I mean, me and Jess will watch those like home makeover shows or renovation shows where you start watching those, man, I wish my house looked like that. I wish I had that kind of feature or that kind of design in my house. And you start looking at yours, man, this place is junk. What is this? And so the horrible thing about covetousness is that you look at everything you don't have, and then everything you do have, you start saying, I hate all this. So not only do you say to God, hey, you haven't given me enough, you say to God, hey, what you've given me isn't even good, it's total junk. And I think that's like where it gets so dangerous.
Yeah. That recalls the verse, I preached on it a while back. It was one of the first sermons I ever did, and so I probably don't want to ever listen to it again because I don't want to hear how choppy it sounded. But it was out of Ephesians 5, and this language Paul uses is very interesting to me. Paul wrote, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. And so what Paul did there is he talked about impurity, he talked about sexual immorality in the same breath, and I think this is a weird one. Christians don't often think this way. In the same breath, he talks about covetousness, and he says these sins are so heinous and so egregious that we shouldn't even talk about them among ourselves. That means that we can fall into these acceptable sins where we say, whoa, man, like I love that truck that you just got. And then I go home and I start looking at trucks on the internet. And now I notice every scratch that's on my truck. And I notice how it doesn't have a very good sound system. And these seats are kind of threadbare, and now I'm not thankful that I have a better vehicle than, the whole history of the world could even imagine having. It's dependable, it's powerful, it gets me where I want to go. All I do is focus on what God's not done. And it makes me hate what I have. And this is a heart that's so far away from worship, and it leads into so many other sinful avenues that it's really a cancer that, I think you can hear it in Paul's language. It needs to be cut out entirely. It needs to be gone.
Yeah, you say it leads to, like, somebody might ask, how does it lead to so many other sins? I think, just hearing you talk just even then, is that if we are not content with what God has given, and we really do start saying, no, God, even what you have given is bad, then where's our faith to trust God in anything, in any part of our life? If sin is ultimately taking our life into our own hands, saying, this is what's going to satisfy me, this is what's going to be good for me, then covetousness just reinforces that idea over and over and over again. Like, if you have a heart of covetousness, sin's just going to be easier and easier and easier because God can't be trusted.
That's right. Wow, and I didn't even, that really puts a point to it, to think about it that way. And so I wanted to kind of transition here and talk about, we've talked about ways that we personally covet, but I also wanted to talk about ways that, I know we're going to get into this soon, and I don't want to go deep into this topic right now, but there's a lot of talk about systems and that sort of thing. But I do think that we have some systems that can be put in place that really promote covetousness. And I'm gonna hit first, like, the American dream. Like, when we take away biblical Christianity and we start to mix it with, unbiblical patriotism and saying, America's the greatest that's ever happened. First of all, we have to say, the American government, I'm going to say it right here, it may be a hot take, but I don't think so. I've thought about it a lot. Is the American government really the greatest government that's ever existed? I would say undoubtedly, according to Scripture, no.
Yeah, it has to be Solomon and King David.
That's exactly right. It has to be the government that God instilled in his people back in the Old Testament. And so let's deal with that falsehood the right way. But one of the things that has come from the American experiment, when it really goes off the rails and it doesn't look at others, and I would argue that the founding of America was looking at the grace of God, and it really emphasized freedom to worship.
Well, religious freedom was religious freedom was integral because the first settlers in America were pilgrims and escaping religious persecution.
And so they were looking at something bigger than themselves. They were looking at the freedom to worship God and that sort of thing. But then as system, as sinful people are involved in the whole situation, one of the things that comes out is you get phrases like keeping up with the Jones, or things like pulling, the American dream. And really, the American dream at its root can be about what somebody else has.
Well, it's like almost, you said, it's like all of America's culture is built on covetousness. I mean, seriously, like every bit of advertising is saying your
Yeah.
life is not as good without this product.
And we would differentiate. We would not say the founding of America or America's legal system. We would say what has become of the culture of America.
Just the ethos of the culture of where you're always wanting the next best, brightest thing.
Mm-hmm.
That everything gets so old so quick. Every year there needs to be a new iPhone. It means just this idea that nothing's ever good enough.
Yeah.
That there's always something else to be gained. And I think that's why Christians, have to war against materialism so much in America.
And it manifests in loving the world.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's what it is. It's loving the world. I mean, everyone struggles with materialism. If you live in America, you struggle with materialism.
Yeah.
Because some of your materials start getting taken away, guess who's getting upset?
Yeah. And so I think there has been some backlash to this idea, right, in the culture. And so we have a very old idea that's kind of made its way around again. And that's to say, well, if people are so materialistic and if keeping up with the Joneses leaves so many people destitute and oppressed, then what about socialism, where we just basically smooth everything out and make everybody have equal stuff? Is that a biblical response?
I don't think so. I get really frustrated when I hear Christians saying Jesus was a feminist, socialist, egalitarian, whatever you want to say. Like, I just think that you're applying things to Jesus that aren't true. I think that Jesus talked about money more than anybody else. I think that Jesus used, listen, just one of the things, I thought about this the other day. It's not a proof text by any means, but Jesus in one of the parables, the parable of the talents, God is the master giving talents or resources to servants. And he gives different amounts to different people and expects to steward them accordingly. That God doesn't come back and say, well, you should have all leveled it out. No, like he rewards people based on how well they stewarded those talents. And if God really is the master, he gives different degrees of talents and different degrees of things. Like God himself, in his own nature and the way human life works, says that God is not a socialist. Now, I think why socialism gets so popular I think why socialism gets into the church is because we look at heaven and see where there is perfect justice, there is perfect righteousness. But the Bible also says in heaven there's differing degrees of rewards.
Yep.
That some Christians have more rewards than others, but it doesn't mean that anyone's over other people. I think that they look at heaven and they think that heaven looks like this completely flat, level playing field when that's not even what heaven is like. And at the end of the day, when people say, well, I believe in socialism, I believe in Christian socialism, I believe socialism can work because that's what God's plan is. That one verse, listen, you want a proof text, is this one, don't covet. I mean, socialism really is all about coveting. It's about saying, I want what the rich people have. Listen, do I want to have a life like Jerry Jones? Be pretty sick.
Yeah.
He's got a giant yacht. Be kind of awesome.
Yeah, seems like it.
But guess what? Jesus also says, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Do I really want that kind of life?
Yeah,
No.
if you have a hard time with loving the world in your estate right now,
It's God's grace that you're not rich.
imagine how much more difficult it is to struggle with not loving the world when you have all of the things the world has. That's the whole book of Ecclesiastes.
That's what I want to say to people. What if, the things that we covet, like the lifestyles of the rich and the lifestyles of the famous people in the world, the things that we covet, what if, just crazy throwing this out there, what if that's actually God's passive judgment on people to keep them from seeing their need for Christ? And you being poor is actually God's grace on you for showing you need a Savior.
And I would say this too. I think it's become fashionable because of this. First of all, there's a guy I like to listen to a lot, and I know you don't like him that much, and I won't mention him by name, but he talks about when it's really popular, and he's coined the phrase LARPing, which is live action RPG, right? Yeah. Live action role playing. He calls it LARPing whenever pastors try to sound prophetic by fighting the battles of 100 years ago. So so to speak, like me coming out and slamming the hammer down and saying American slavery, the whole system was man stealing. It should have been punishable. The church should have never had anything to do with it. That would be LARPing because no one disagrees with me now. Speaking prophetically about that doesn't cost me anything. But this one right now, in our context, it is going to take a cost with it when we say that socialism is an anti-biblical position, because what socialism does is it basically promotes covetousness, because the whole thing is based off of everybody wants something that they don't have. But the other side of this is the false notion that poverty, that being poor is somehow being more Christ-like. Being poor can be the estate that God has given, but there are so many examples in the Bible of godly men who were exceedingly wealthy. One of them right off the bat is Nehemiah. We just did a series. Nehemiah was unimaginably wealthy. Abraham was so wealthy, in his time. Solomon obviously had wealth that we can't even imagine or dream of. And so it's not about wealth. It is always about our heart. Does your heart long for the things of the world? If it does, then you are going to be falling out of worship with God. And socialism at its front, Christians should not buy into this. Christians should beware to know that what socialism does is it tries to bring heaven on earth. It tries to make a utopia here that's based on perfect equity, and no one's oppressed because everybody has the same thing. But we know, and we've seen time and time again through different countries who use this experiment, that what socialism really does is it sets up another bunch of fat cats who parcel out stuff to other people and oppress them like crazy.
Well, why? It's because it's equality and justice without God at the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to make heaven on earth without God being a part of it at all. And that's not heaven in any kind of sense biblically.
Yeah.
Like, I think that Christians would do well to kind of evaluate everything according to the Word of God and through the Word. And when you look at that kind of worldview, it just is untenable. It doesn't make sense. And even within the church, like, because people also use that verse in Acts 2 where all the saints were selling things and nobody had any need because everybody had something in common with each other.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that nobody had any need, but it doesn't mean everybody still had the same amount of wealth.
Right.
It just means that the wealthy saints in the church were taking care of the poor when they were losing their jobs and getting persecuted. And how we know that? Because James, Jesus' brother, is talking about rich and poor people. He does not go to the rich people in the church and say, why aren't you giving all your wealth to the poor? Why aren't you making it where you're all the same playing field? No, he says, hey, poor people, don't show partiality to the rich people. And rich people, you need to be generous with your wealth.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just hoard it.
Yeah,
So
no.
no, I'm not arguing that people should hoard wealth and that it's like this ungodly, that's unjust capitalism, where it's just, hey, let's just hoard the wealth and don't ever be generous to anybody else. Because I would tell people, if you're hoarding the wealth God has given you, you're not being a steward, and you're going to be held accountable for that.
In fact, you are really, figuratively, you're the guy who buried it in the ground.
Yeah.
Right? And that person, that steward had judgment cast on him.
That God's people, we receive the wealth that the Lord gives, and we try to be as generous as we can with it.
Mm-hmm. And we would call that investing in eternal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We use our resources to invest. We see them truly. The heart against covetousness, the opposite of this, is seeing everything we have as being a gift of God that's out of his bounty, knowing and trusting by faith that God will provide for our needs according to his riches. And our needs, we do have physical needs. We have the need for food. We have the need for shelter. We also have the need for a lot of spiritual things. We have the need to understand God's truth. We have the need to worship God. We have the need to grow in Christ-likeness. And I think that's where, to put a capper on this whole discussion of the law, we follow the law because we love God. And we do that by faith, knowing that, as you go through the Pentateuch, and God will often give these commands, and he'll say right before or right after these commands, I am the Lord. Mm-hmm. He'll say, do this, and then he'll say, I am the Lord. Why does he say that? He says it because his people need to be courageous and have faith, knowing that we obey God because we have faith that God is going to fulfill all of his promises to us. And that's the opposite of covetousness, is it not? Why would we covet if we truly have faith that God is going to provide us with everything he's promised us?
Well, and look at Christ's own example, is that he left heaven. He left the place where he had everything, had all the praise, all the glory, all the majesty, had need of nothing. I mean, he's God. He needs nothing.
Mm-hmm.
To come to earth, to be a poor, marginalized Galilean, roaming the countryside, preaching the gospel. That Christ said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. And that Christians can take a look at Christ and follow his example and say, you know what? This earth is not my home. There's bigger things here. There's kingdom things here. What if I stop desiring the world as much as I desire laying up treasures for myself in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal? And that's what Christ did. Christ, throughout his whole life, did not covet. He never coveted because he was never idolatrous. And instead, he died the death of an idolater. He died the death of all these people that covet things, say, God, what you've given is not good enough. That Christ submitted himself to the will of the Father and said, God, you are good, and what you've given is good.
And particularly what God gave is his most precious, his unblemished lamb, his only son. He gave us what he didn't even require of Abraham back in Genesis. He didn't spare his own son, but he gave him up. And I think, I've really enjoyed talking about the law, and I really do. I like how it ends here, because I do think that this particular commandment goes to the heart, and it really blatantly goes to the heart. And I like what you just said there, that Jesus and Jesus' ministry is the anti-covetousness. He didn't covet anything. He knew that he had everything, and he didn't look at that as a thing to be grasped. He emptied it out.
He didn't covet, and not only did he not covet, he gave. He gave of his own blood. He gave himself. He didn't hold anything onto himself.
Well, I really can't think of anything to add to that. And so, like I said, I've had a really good time doing this, and I'm also ready to move on to the next thing. And so, we hope you guys have really enjoyed this discussion of the Ten Commandments, and we hope that you'll keep on listening and join us again next time as we start something new on Everyday Discipleship.